Does the news of Scott Drew staying at Baylor mean that the open Louisville job is Dusty May's to lose? It's very possible that is the case. We'll explain why on today's episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Stay tuned.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Today's episode brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what an adventure could be around the next corner? Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Check them all out today at nissanusa.com. I want to take this time to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services 5 days a week, your team every day. News came out on Wednesday and was confirmed on Thursday. Baylor head coach Scott Drew staying in Waco. Really no surprise, truthfully. But does this mean that the open Louisville job is Dusty May's to lose? I think it's a very strong possibility. We'll answer why here coming up shortly. And then to conclude the show, we will dive into a weekly mailbag segment. Haven't had one of those in a couple weeks, so we have some great questions to answer. So we start out in Texas, where on Wednesday, Baylor head coach Scott Drew went on a radio show. And forgive me for not knowing exactly what radio show that is, but he went on a show and was asked about the Louisville job. And his answer sparked people to claim that he was staying at Baylor. And I'm like, well, I didn't really feel like Louisville had a significant chance, so I didn't feel one way or the other. It was like, okay, now we move on. But when Brooks Holton posted the clip on Twitter, I clicked on it and listened to it, and my first thought was, this feels like classic coach speak to me. This doesn't really feel like a true denial. Like, I feel like he danced around the question. He said a lot of things, but one thing he didn't say was no. Now, need I remind you that in no point of this search have I felt like Scott Drew was realistically considering Louisville. Even though the Cardinals were rumored to offer something in the neighborhood of over $8 million annual per year, I still felt like if it got to where money was the reason, Baylor was going to get close enough to where it didn't make sense for him to leave. But that didn't really, for those who were looking for hope, that radio clip gave you a little bit of hope. But on Thursday, all of that hope was squashed. In an article from The Athletic, Drew made a short and sweet quote, but it got right to the point. He says, "My family is happy at Baylor. I'm happy at Baylor. We're extremely blessed to be here. We're staying at Baylor." And that closes any type of possibility of the former national championship head coach making his way to the Derby City. But like I said, not really much to be upset about. I feel like you're either in two groups. There was one group that felt like Louisville never had a chance, that it was only hype that was being manufactured from the Cardinals side, that maybe Louisville took a swing but didn't really have a realistic chance and still offered. And there was another portion of the fan base that felt like Drew legitimately had been considering Louisville. Trilly Donovan, everyone's favorite pseudo college basketball insider, stated in a clip or in a picture that he shared that it was a text back in December that Drew was entertaining Louisville. That might have been the case. I mean, if you're Scott Drew and you're listening to Louisville's offer, I think listening and hearing out a program and what they have to say is completely different than actually having a realistic chance to leave your program. So you're either on one side of the table the second side obviously believing that this is sort of Drew's final decision and that he went back and forth. I think, like I always do, the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle there. There was probably a little bit more interest expressed than noted by Baylor fans, but I don't think it was ever as serious as some in Louisville made it out to be. Regardless, it doesn't matter because Scott is not leaving Waco. So it makes a ton of sense for him. He has such a great situation going on in Waco to where he's got the new arena. He just won a national championship. He is a local legend there. His family is rooted there. It matches up with his religious beliefs down there in Waco. And for all intents and purposes across the board, leaving Waco didn't really make a ton of sense for Scott unless, like I mentioned in my episode when we talked about Scott Drew, what did I say? What was the one thing that I felt like was going to be the true deciding factor? Whether or not Scott Drew wanted a new challenge. And I'm not calling anyone a liar on either side of the table. Don't take this as me calling BS. What I am saying is that my true opinion was that if Scott Drew wanted a new challenge, he would come to Louisville. But if he didn't, he would stay at Baylor, because even if Louisville could throw that money at the table at Drew, which you probably have it on good authority that the Cardinals did, then it would make sense that Baylor would get close, because although they might not have the NIL infrastructure that Louisville does, there's money down there in Texas. There's money in Waco, Texas. So it shouldn't really surprise anyone. I've seen some people absolutely bummed about this. And I get it. Scott Drew was the number one priority, and I credit Josh Hurd and company for going out and taking a swing on one of the best coaches in college basketball. With a hire like this, with a job opening of this gravity, you have to swing big for the fences. So I applaud the effort, but like I mentioned, I felt like we had to be realistic. That's why, and I caught some flack for this in DMs, in the comments, saying that, hey, Louisville can go get Scott Drew. They're a big enough program. Yes, Louisville is a better program than Baylor across the board, historically speaking. But the context truly matters. That's why one comment that I made specifically was, I'm not going to treat Drew as a realistic option until I'm shown that there is an actual possibility that the Cardinals could land him. And at no point did the national media really ever give it the time of day. Everything was manufactured from the local side of things. So if there was some national interest from that side and the media was talking about, well, hey, look, be on the lookout for Scott Drew and Louisville, then I think you treat this in a different manner. But ultimately, it doesn't matter because Scott Drew's not coming. But the main thing we had to focus on now is, well, who's it going to be? Because we talked about a couple guys, Dusty May and Mick Cronin, as probably being the two other likely candidates. But there's also been like word floated of mystery candidates, which either is just pure speculation and conspiracy, or there is legitimate substance to that take. However, with how close to chest this search has been conducted, it's almost impossible to tell. So, but what I will say is that I do believe that it is Florida Atlantic head coach Dusty May's job to lose. These next, I don't want to say 48 hours is critical because Florida Atlantic plays tomorrow, the first game of the day against Northwestern. But when Florida Atlantic loses, which I would assume it's going to be in the first weekend because I don't think they're going to get past UConn, but stranger things have happened. That's when you focus on if the wheels start turning, if things move rather quickly. But first, I've got to explain to you why it's Dusty May's job to lose. And if you've been following this search, that really shouldn't surprise you. We'll have a discussion and an explanation here coming up after we talk about our friends and the title sponsor of the show, Nissan. This week's March Madness Bracket Highlight is brought to you by our friends over at Nissan. Each week, we're picking one team that stands out, a team that's pushed it further than the rest, just like any of the all-new 2024 Nissan SUVs. These guys were able to take it to the next level. The Oregon Ducks just got a very solid victory over the South Carolina Gamecocks. They are this week's Nissan Rogue. The team absolutely surprised us all with the powerful performance in the final Pac-12 tournament, punching their ticket to the big dance. They say win life, go Rogue, and that's exactly what the Ducks have done here, now into the round of 32. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. Also want to take this time to tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. One thing that I love about FanDuel and March Madness are the profit boosts. The past 2 days for the first four, I have had a two-leg parlay on each day. Won them, but won even more with the profit boost built in. 50% profit boost on the first day of March Madness, and I would assume the profit boosts will continue, so be sure to get in on the action. But new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Cardinal fans, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news. Streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Dusty May is the guy that everyone has been talking about over the past couple of days. About a week ago, I had an episode that basically stated/regurgitated the information or the rumors that Dusty May was one of the early leaders for the Cardinals job. It was all going to depend if Scott Drew turned down the job. Scott Drew did turn down the job. So two names started to rise up, Mick Cronin and Dusty May. And over the past weekend, and even early this week, Mick Cronin's name felt like it was gaining some steam within Louisville social media circles. But the issue was that, like I mentioned, with how close to chest Josh Hurt is conducting this search, there are very minimal leaks at all. It's just been really challenging to understand where the search is, whether it's Dusty, whether it's Mick, whether it's insert candidate here. Nobody really has had a great idea. Up until now, it feels like at this moment, it is Dusty May's job to lose. May has been floated around for this job, both on the local and national scale of media, and it is only continuing to push or only continuing to gain steam. He was asked about potential job openings in his pre-NCAA tournament press conference, and I felt like the obvious was pretty straight, or the answer was pretty straightforward. It was obvious as to what he was doing. He was dodging the question. He said that it's distracting having to be asked that question, just like it's distracting. I forget the analogy he used, but like kids screaming when you're trying to watch film or something like that. I don't know the analogy that he used, but he said something to push the narrative that there are many distracting things in his job, and that being asked about coaching opportunities is one of those. It's pretty clear that Dusty May's name has been thrown out for a bunch of different jobs, Ohio State, Louisville, now Michigan, but it feels like Louisville is probably the most likely landing spot. But let me caution you to believe that this is a done deal. And it might be, but let me caution you to at least be cautious, because number one, stranger things have happened. Just because a guy is a heavy favorite for the job doesn't mean things can't fall apart at the 11th hour. They've happened before. They will happen again. We'll see if it happens with this search. And number two, there's been this narrative floated around out there that Dusty May and Scott Drew were both smokescreens for a mystery third candidate that no one is talking about. Now, if you keep your nose pretty close to the ground when it comes to Louisville media and Louisville insiders, at various times, even before Kenny Payne was fired, multiple people have stated that the guy that Josh Hurd is looking at, he's a name that you're not hearing. And Dusty May's name was floated out there pretty early, along with Mick Cronin and even Scott Drew. But there was obviously no substance at the moment because it's really hard to tell the difference right now between legitimate substance and just complete BS or complete speculation. Because the harsh reality, and this is going to be really literally, there's either a mystery candidate or there is not. And what we have to focus on is the timeline. That's why I don't think Mick Cronin is getting the job. Obviously, Bring Braum Home, that Twitter account who has been notorious for trying to spread the Mick is the pick narrative for this fan base. He came out on Thursday and stated that he does not believe Mick is going to be the pick and that he will support Josh Hurd in his quest to find the next men's basketball coach. That's another reason why I don't think Mick is going to get it in the timeline. Mick's season ended last week, and we haven't heard anything. Now, maybe Louisville, at the end of the day, is trying to get past that buyout. Some believe they can. Some believe they definitely cannot. Regardless, I don't think it's going to matter because I don't think it's going to be Mick. Another thing that I found interesting, something that was brought to my attention, shout out to my guy in one of the Discord chats for bringing it up. He's very, very savvy when it comes to the ins and outs of coaching searches and coaching hires because of the line of work that he does. But there was a situation to where the University of Louisville posted the assistant coaching jobs on I think it was Indeed, the job posting platform. And it was the assistant coach, I think director of basketball ops, videographer, so on and so forth. To my understanding, and what he was very adamant in saying, and he wasn't the only one to say this because it was repeated multiple times, usually a university doesn't do that unless they have a very good idea of who the coach is going to be. And it would make sense that with the timeline, Dusty May, now nothing has come out, but we've heard that Jeff Goodman say Dusty May is going to have his choice of where he wants to go. Others have said Dusty May has an offer on the table from the University of Louisville. It seems like everything is starting to subliminally be pieced together slowly to where all signs are pointing right to the coach down in Boca Raton. Now, he does play in the NCAA tournament on Friday against Northwestern early on in the day. And I personally believe that if Dusty loses that game, that if he is the guy, the latest it would be announced would be Monday. There is a chance that it could be announced over the weekend. There could be a chance that it's announced late on the weekend, but I think Monday would be the latest, maybe even the most likely of when it's announced. But ultimately, I think it's Dusty May's job to lose. You're seeing the fan base sort of start to talk about him a lot more. Now, grand scheme of things, it doesn't mean anything with how the coaching search is being conducted. At this point in time, I just don't necessarily feel comfortable discussing a ton of mystery candidates when there have been so many names that have been crossed off the list. Who even knows? And there's only so many guys that fit the bill. And with those guys, it still feels unlikely that they leave their current situation. So even as close to chest as this is being kept, I think you can read between the leaves here and understand that all signs ultimately are pointing to Dusty May, in my opinion, or everyone is just wrong. And there is a very, very real possibility that that is the case. Only thing you can say is, well, let's see. Wait and see. So I do think, for the record, that it is Dusty May's job to lose. And ultimately, it's kind of weird because I've kind of flipped my thought on whether I would rather have Mick or Dusty, because I think the day after I posted that episode of saying that I'd rather have Mick than Dusty, I'm like, I did a little bit of a deeper dive into both candidates. I was like, I'd rather have Dusty. So kind of sucks that I had to flip-flop there, but truthfully, that's my opinion, changed with more information. So we have a mailbag to dive into. We haven't done that in a couple weeks. There are some great questions, and we're going to answer them here in just a moment after we tell you about our friends over at Amazon Fire TV. Fire TV is your destination for all sports, live games, highlights, in-depth analysis, etc. I just recently bought a Fire TV stick, and it is fantastic, plugged right into my TV, and now I have access to millions of movies and TV episodes, along with free and live TV. Baseball's coming up, March Madness, etc. Makes a ton of sense. The Fire TV Channels app delivers a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. That includes all of us here at Locked On and most of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. Check out Fire TV Channels app on Fire TV and Alexa devices. If you haven't checked out Fire TV Channels, you should. Trust me on this. To learn more, visit www.amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. We haven't had a weekly mailbag in a couple weeks, and I feel bad for not having it, but I also understand that due to the urgency of where Louisville's at, with having to do a coaching search, that there's some other stuff we need to talk about. But I'm going to answer a couple questions. This one is from my guy, Maxwell Bird, on Twitter. He asks, while I'm an overall Muss fan, is he to blame for the trouble this year? Tried something and it didn't work out. Just seems like he pulled so much talent to not have more success. No, I agree with you there, Max. Muss is the one to blame there. He handpicked this team. Now, I believe that there are some things going on in that program that are out of his control, but ultimately this was his team. They never looked comfortable on the court with each other, and that's sort of the risk of going out every offseason and replacing your entire team. So I think Muss is to blame, and I think him being so bad this year, it's one of the reasons why I feel like a lot of people cooled off of him as an option for the coaching job. He is, 58, 59 now? So there's the age portion of that as well. But yes, to answer your question, Max, I do think Muss is to blame. Couple of other questions. This was posted in a group chat. Do you have any takeaways already from spring ball at the moment? Not really. It's way too early. Spring ball started on Tuesday. I do know that Tyler Barron will miss the entirety of the spring, or likely miss the entirety of the spring, with an injury, is the news coming out of the spring, and hopefully he's ready for fall camp. But same stuff you would expect, mistakes that need to be corrected. It's early on, but apparently the conditioning looks good. So a testament to how well the team put in that work over the past couple months in the offseason. So shout out to the guys. Moving on, Dave Skull on ESPN radio mentioned that Harrison Bailey got the second most snaps at QB for the Cardinals. What do you make of that? I think it's pretty interesting. I want to see what that looks like in the preseason and fall camp, because right now I think a veteran guy like Bailey could be at the lead, but I would think that Brady Allen and Pierce Clarkson both contend for that spot, with Shuck being the guy at QB1. But I think it's pretty interesting. There are some that are very, very high on Harrison Bailey's talents, And for our sake, I hope they're right. So I think it's pretty interesting. I'm not going to put too much emphasis on it just yet because it's still very, very early, but interesting to say the least. Last football question. Ron English mentioned his disappointment with TJ Capers, said they were looking for him to do some things that he hasn't done. Does this cause concern? It does, truthfully. Brian Smith, Locked On Podcast Network national recruiting analyst, covers the South Florida area, said TJ Capers, one of the most talented players in the recruiting class that he came from, but has to put it together. Rehabbed from an injury last year, and if he's not, checking off all the boxes that the coaching staff wants him to do, that doesn't really bode well for number one playing time coming up, but potentially number two, the longevity of his stint here in Louisville. And obviously, I don't want to jump the gun and say that based upon that comment alone, he's going to transfer. I'm just saying that we were hoping to hear better news that, he looks good in the weight room. The talent is there. It's just a matter of getting comfortable with the speed. I don't know what exactly they were looking for him to do that he hasn't done, but judging, granted, all we can do is judge off the comments alone. And for face value, that's just not a good comment. So, of course, that's going to cause a little bit of concern, especially for a guy who's uber talented and you would really want him to play a big role. So moving on back to the basketball side of things, there was a post on Facebook that Curtis Williams blamed the fans for him leaving and not because of Kenny Payne getting fired. Okay, that's the end of the question. It wasn't even a question. It was a statement, but I understand where you're coming from. I think it's a fake quote, truthfully. First of all, let me tell you, Louisville Facebook, it's not the place where you want to go get your Cardinals news. I have left many, many fan groups and pages on Louisville Facebook because of just how off the wall some things that are said on there. And I look at it and I'm like, you can believe what you believe, but man, I just can't. So, no, that post, I think it was misleading. Some say that Curtis made a comment on his Instagram story and took it down pretty quickly after that. But at this point, I just have no reason to believe that that's what he said because there's no proof of him saying that. And it's very dangerous to put out a quote out there that he said that because it completely tarnishes the reputation of the fan base and it creates another false narrative. I mean, stuff spreads like wildfire in terms of rumors and gossip, and it gets annoying and old. So, no, I mean, I'm not putting much stock into that at all. So, last question in the mailbag, who do you think stays from this year's team? I had a segment on this where I think 5 players are in contention of staying, in my opinion. Sky, Brandon, Mike James, JJ, and Caleb. I think 4 of them stay. I think Brandon, Sky, and Mike ultimately stay, and then one of JJ and Caleb. So if you make me pick, I would probably say Caleb, but one or the other. So that's going to conclude today's mailbag. We'll see you right back here tomorrow, but this has been another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Have fun watching March Madness. We'll be back soon.